One narrow waterway. One political gamble. And one decision that could make the whole world pay. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and support our work, because this story is bigger than one headline, and we are going to keep following every move that matters. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. Donald Trump's blockade tied to Iranian ports is being presented as a show of strength. But that is the first illusion we need to strip away. This is not just a military move. It is not just another episode in the long conflict between the United States and Iran. And it is certainly not a problem that stays in the Persian Gulf. The moment the Strait of Hormuz becomes a pressure point in this war, the meaning of the war changes completely. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just geography. It is infrastructure. It is leverage. It is one of the narrow places where global power, global trade, and global fear all collide. When a president threatens commercial flows around one of the most important energy choke points on Earth, he is not simply sending a message to Iran. He is sending a message to oil markets, shipping insurers, NATO allies, Asian importers, and American families who will feel this first at the gas pump and then everywhere else. That is the real story here. Trump wants this to look like a clean act of pressure. Iran squeezes, the United States squeezes harder. But power is never that simple when it touches the bloodstream of the world economy. The moment you weaponize a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, you are no longer operating inside a narrow battlefield. You are shaking a system. Prices move. Risk spreads. Allies recalculate. Rivals watch. And every actor starts asking the same question: is the United States still defending order, or is it now becoming another source of disorder? That question matters because the United States has spent decades claiming a larger role in the world. The United States was supposed to be the country that kept the sea lanes open, not the country that turned them into instruments of political shock. And once that image begins to crack, the consequences go far beyond Iran. They reach China. They reach Europe. They reach every country that depends on maritime trade and every voter who depends on economic stability. So this is where the story truly begins. Not with a ship. Not with a speech. But with a dangerous shift in the structure of power itself. What looks like control may actually be exposure. And what sounds like strength may be the start of a far more expensive crisis. Why Hormuz is never just a waterway. The Strait of Hormuz is often described like it is just a narrow channel on a map, a shipping lane, a technical route for oil tankers, a distant corridor most Americans will never see. That description is true, but it misses the real point. The Strait of Hormuz is not important because of what it looks like. It is important because of what it does. It is one of the few places on Earth where geography can still dictate politics, where a thin strip of water can pressure presidents, rattle financial markets, divide alliances, and push households thousands of miles away into economic stress. That is why Trump's blockade matters so much. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a route. It is a pricing machine. It is a fear machine. It is a leverage machine. Roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil moves through that passage, and that means any threat there travels fast through the global system. Not slowly. Not in theory. Immediately. The market does not wait for full shortages. It reacts to risk, to headlines, to uncertainty, to the possibility that something could go wrong. And in an energy market already tight with political tension, possibility alone can be enough to move billions of dollars. This is the part Washington often pretends not to see. The United States may produce far more energy than it did decades ago, but the United States is not insulated from global price shocks. Oil is globally priced. Shipping insurance is globally priced. Freight costs are globally priced. So when the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable, the cost does not stay in the Persian Gulf. It moves through refinery margins, airline fuel costs, trucking rates, manufacturing inputs, food transport, and finally into the emotional center of American political life, the price sign at the gas station. And that is where a waterway becomes power. Because whoever can disrupt the Strait of Hormuz, threaten the Strait of Hormuz, or claim to secure the Strait of Hormuz is not just influencing ships. They are influencing expectations. They are shaping how investors think, how governments plan, how corporations hedge, and how voters feel. In modern political economy, that is real force. It is not abstract. It is system-wide pressure. History warns us not to underestimate places like this. Suez taught the world that a narrow passage can shake empires. The oil shocks of the 1970s proved that energy insecurity can reorder politics far from the battlefield. The Strait of Hormuz sits in that same category. It is one of those rare strategic points where the local and the global collapse into each other. So no, the Strait of Hormuz is never just a waterway. It is a pressure valve for the modern world. And when leaders start treating that valve like a weapon, they are not just testing an adversary. They are testing the resilience of the entire system. Trump's logic, coercion as strategy, pressure as performance. Donald Trump's logic is not complicated. That is what makes it dangerous. He believes pressure works best when it is public, personal, and impossible to ignore. He does not just want leverage. He wants visible leverage. He wants the other side to feel cornered, the audience to feel impressed, and the political system to feel that only he is willing to act with force. In Trump's world, pressure is never only strategy. It is performance. It is policy staged as dominance. That is exactly how this blockade should be understood. It is not simply a response to failed talks. It is an attempt to reassert control over the story after diplomacy stopped producing the image of strength Trump wanted. That distinction matters. Because when a leader begins to use coercion not only to shape outcomes, but to shape appearances, the line between statecraft and spectacle starts to disappear. On paper, the theory looks familiar. Increase the cost. Tighten the pressure. Force Iran to conclude that resistance is more expensive than compromise. This is the classic logic of coercive bargaining. Hurt the other side enough, and eventually they move. But real coercion only works when the target believes three things at once: that the pressure will last, that the person applying it has a clear endgame, and that there is still an exit worth taking. If any one of those conditions is weak, pressure stops looking like strategy and starts looking like improvisation. That is the vulnerability in Trump's approach. He wants maximum effect now. He wants Iran to bend, markets to believe he is serious, rivals to hesitate, and voters at home to see a president who never backs down. But a policy designed to create shock can also create doubt. Allies begin to wonder whether this is discipline or impulse. Markets begin to ask whether the White House is managing escalation or simply escalating because it cannot afford to look passive. And Iran begins to calculate that the man raising the pressure may be under pressure himself. That is where the politics become inseparable from the economics. Leaders who feel exposed at home often reach for force abroad because external confrontation can restore the appearance of command. But the financial system is not a rally crowd. Oil traders do not reward bravado. Insurers do not price emotion. Shipping firms do not move on applause. They move on risk. And risk is exactly what Trump is injecting into the system. So this is the deeper truth. Trump is not just trying to compel Iran. He is trying to dominate the tempo, the optics, and the emotional field of the crisis. But power that depends too heavily on theater becomes unstable. Because once performance becomes part of the strategy, escalation is no longer judged only by results. It is judged by whether the leader can keep looking strong while the costs spread everywhere else. Tehran's bet: survive, stretch time, raise the cost. Iran's bet is colder, harder, and more disciplined than many people in Washington want to admit. Iran does not need to defeat the United States in a conventional military sense to survive this crisis. It does not need to outgun Trump. It does not need to dominate the sea. It does not need a dramatic battlefield victory. It only needs to endure longer than the American political system can tolerate the rising cost of confrontation. That is the calculation. That is the strategy. And if you understand that, you understand why this conflict is so dangerous. Iran's leadership knows the balance of force is against it. But weaker states have always looked for another arena where strength can be neutralized. In this case, that arena is time. Time shifts pressure. Time changes narratives. Time raises costs. Time tests political patience. Iran is betting that the longer this standoff continues, the less it will look like a clean act of American dominance and the more it will look like a self-inflicted global shock with a very clear domestic price tag for Trump. That is not wishful thinking on Iran's part. It is grounded in how power actually works. The United States is militarily stronger, but it is also economically exposed in a different way. American voters do not experience war first through troop maps. They experience it through prices, through uncertainty, through headlines about energy, inflation, and instability. Iran understands that in a democracy, visible consumer pain can become political pain very fast. A regime under sanctions may absorb suffering brutally and for too long. An elected government facing angry drivers, nervous investors, and rising living costs faces a different kind of vulnerability. So Iran's strategy is not simply resistance. It is cost transfer. Push enough risk into the system, and the cost of punishing Iran starts spreading outward into fuel markets, shipping flows, alliance politics, and consumer psychology. That changes the argument. It turns pressure into backlash. It makes every extra week of confrontation more politically loaded than the week before. There is also a brutal historical lesson here. States under siege do not always collapse on schedule. Often they adapt, reroute, ration, harden, and wait for the stronger side to overreach. Iran is likely betting that Trump, like many leaders before him, is more comfortable launching pressure than managing a drawn-out contest of endurance. And that is the heart of Iran's wager. Not that Iran is stronger. Not that Iran is safer. But that Trump may discover too late that the side with the bigger navy is not always the side with the greater staying power. In a crisis built on rising cost, survival itself can become a form of strategic counterattack. The pirate power problem, when the United States starts looking like the disruptor. The real danger in Trump's blockade is not only what it does on the water. It is what it does to the identity of the United States in the world. For decades, the United States has told a very specific story about its role in the global system. The United States was not just another powerful country with ships and sanctions. It was supposed to be the guarantor of open trade, the protector of sea lanes, the state that kept the arteries of commerce flowing even when the world was unstable. That story mattered. It lowered fear. It reassured allies. It gave Washington something more valuable than force alone, legitimacy. Now that legitimacy is being tested in one of the worst possible places. The Strait of Hormuz is not a random stretch of water. It is one of the narrow passages where the world economy becomes physically vulnerable. When Trump threatens commercial movement tied to Iranian ports in that environment, the issue is no longer just military pressure on Iran. The issue becomes whether the United States still looks like the guardian of a rules-based order, or whether it now looks like a superpower willing to bend the rules of navigation whenever strategic frustration and political ego demand it. That distinction is everything. Because in global politics, power is never only about what a country can do. It is also about what others believe that country stands for when it acts. A navy can intercept ships. A president can issue threats. Markets can be forced to respond. But when the state doing all of that is the same state that has spent generations preaching freedom of navigation, free commerce, and maritime stability, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. The world begins to ask a hard question: if the United States can turn a strategic choke point into an instrument of political punishment, then what exactly separates American order from selective maritime coercion? That is where the pirate power problem begins. Now, let's be precise. This is not about using the word piracy as a cheap insult. It is about understanding why that frame becomes politically powerful the moment the United States appears to threaten commercial access in or around one of the most critical waterways on Earth. In the public mind, and in the mind of many governments watching from a distance, the distinction between lawful interdiction and power-backed intimidation is not always clean. It depends on context, consistency, and trust. If those are weak, then even a policy defended with legal language can start to look like something more primitive, the strong taking control of the passage and deciding who gets through. That is a terrible look for the United States. Because the strongest asset of the United States has never been force by itself. Plenty of empires had force. Plenty of authoritarian states have force. The deeper advantage of the United States has been that it could combine force with a larger idea of order. It could persuade allies, investors, shipping companies, and ordinary populations that American power, while often imperfect, still served a stabilizing function. It still protected a wider system. It still kept the commons open. The moment that belief begins to crack, Washington pays a price that does not show up immediately on a battlefield map. It shows up in trust. It shows up in how shipping firms calculate exposure. It shows up in how Asian importers think about dependence. It shows up in how European governments talk about autonomy. It shows up in how rivals like China build their narrative against American hypocrisy. And it shows up in how smaller countries quietly conclude that the global order is not really about rules at all. It is about whoever has the power to interrupt trade and then call that interruption stability. That conclusion would be devastating for the United States over the long term. Because once the United States starts looking like the disruptor, it gives away one of its biggest strategic advantages. It starts to resemble the very behavior it has spent decades condemning. The United States has defended freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. The United States has criticized coercive control of maritime space when exercised by rivals. The United States has framed open trade routes as essential to a stable world. But if the same United States now appears willing to use the Strait of Hormuz as a pressure weapon in a way that threatens commercial movement and injects panic into the energy system, then every future American argument about maritime principle becomes weaker. And China will not miss that opportunity. China does not need to outshout Trump. It does not even need to move first. It only needs to point to the contradiction. It can say, here is the United States, the self-declared defender of free navigation, now using naval dominance to pressure commercial flows in one of the world's most sensitive choke points. It can say, the real doctrine of the United States was never rule-based order, but selective control dressed up as principle. That message will resonate in more places than Washington wants to admit, especially across the global South, where suspicion of Western double standards already runs deep. This is how great powers weaken themselves without noticing it in real time. They begin by making exceptions. Temporary exceptions. Strategic exceptions. Necessary exceptions. But every exception teaches the world something. It teaches allies that principles are conditional. It teaches rivals that hypocrisy is exploitable. It teaches markets that stability can no longer be assumed. And it teaches weaker states that when pressure rises, even the self-appointed guardian of order may start acting like an enforcer above the system rather than a steward within it. History is not kind to powers that make this mistake. Maritime empires have always believed they could police trade routes for reasons of necessity and still keep the moral high ground. Sometimes they could for a while. But over time, coercion leaves residue. It builds resentment. It encourages balancing. It creates workarounds. It turns commercial dependence into strategic anxiety. In the end, force may secure compliance in the moment, but it corrodes trust in the structure. And trust is not sentimental. Trust is economic. Trust lowers insurance premiums. Trust keeps cargo moving. Trust encourages investment. Trust sustains alliances. Trust tells the world that even in crisis, the biggest power on the water is not going to turn a shared artery into a personal bargaining chip. Lose that trust, and the cost of everything rises. The cost of trade rises. The cost of diplomacy rises. The cost of deterrence rises. The cost of leadership rises. This is why Trump's blockade is more dangerous than many of his defenders understand. It is not just a pressure tactic against Iran. It is a reputational gamble with the infrastructure of American leadership. It risks converting the United States from the country that keeps the sea open into the country that decides openness is negotiable when it wants leverage. That may feel strong in the short term. It may even poll well with people who confuse aggression with control. But real strategic power is not just the ability to stop ships. It is the ability to shape the environment without teaching the world to fear your methods more than your enemies. And once the United States starts looking less like the protector of maritime order and more like another power using the sea for political extortion, it will not just have a problem with Iran. It will have a problem with its own image, its own alliances, and its own claim to global leadership. That is the pirate power problem. Not that the United States suddenly loses its strength, but that it begins to use strength in a way that empties its purpose. And when a superpower starts to look like the disruptor, the world does not simply get nervous. It starts looking for a different center of gravity. China enters the equation, from energy buyer to potential strategic flashpoint. China is no longer a side character in this story. It is the shadow hanging over the entire crisis. The moment Trump turns the Strait of Hormuz into an instrument of pressure, he is no longer dealing only with Iran. He is stepping into the supply chain logic of the world's second-largest economy. And that is where a regional blockade starts becoming something much bigger, much more dangerous, and far harder to control. The interest of China here is not ideological first. It is structural. China needs energy. It needs stable flows. It needs predictable access to the Persian Gulf. That means any American attempt to squeeze Iranian exports in or around the Strait of Hormuz does not stay neatly contained inside a United States-Iran confrontation. It lands inside a larger contest over who gets to shape the terms of global commerce. In plain English, if Washington starts interfering with flows tied to Chinese energy security, China will not view that as a side effect. It will view it as a signal. And signals matter in great power politics. Sometimes more than force itself. China does not need to respond with immediate military escalation for this to become a strategic flashpoint. In fact, the smarter move for China may be patience. Let Trump look impulsive. Let Washington unsettle markets. Let NATO allies hesitate. Let the United States carry the political burden of appearing willing to destabilize one of the world's most important trade arteries. Then step forward as the calmer power, the commercially rational power, the power that says it wants stability while the United States brings volatility. That is not weakness. That is strategic positioning. This is what makes the blockade so risky. Trump may think he is tightening the screws on Iran. But if Chinese-linked shipping, Chinese energy interests, or Chinese commercial networks come under pressure, the confrontation widens automatically. Not necessarily into war tomorrow, but into a more dangerous contest over credibility, access, and global hierarchy. Once that happens, every move becomes loaded. If Washington enforces aggressively, escalation risk rises. If it backs off when Chinese interests are involved, the image of American control weakens. That is the trap. And history teaches a brutal lesson here. Great powers can absorb insults. What they do not absorb easily is the sense that another power is testing their access to strategic lifelines. That is when commerce turns into security, and security turns into confrontation. So the entry of China into the equation changes everything. It means the Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a crisis zone. It is now a pressure point in the broader struggle over the future of world order. And when a narrow waterway starts carrying the weight of American power, Iranian resistance, and Chinese dependency all at once, the margin for error becomes terrifyingly small. The Allies pull back. What NATO's refusal really means. What NATO's refusal really means is this: Trump can still command attention, but he can no longer automatically command alignment. And that is a far more serious problem than many people in Washington want to admit. Because in a crisis like this, military power matters, yes, but political legitimacy matters too. An alliance is not just a collection of weapons. It is a judgment. It is a shared decision about whether the leader at the center is acting with discipline, with strategic clarity, and with enough credibility to justify the risks being imposed on everyone else. Right now, that judgment is breaking against Trump. When Keir Starmer refuses to support the blockade, and when Emmanuel Macron moves toward a separate multinational posture focused on navigation after the conflict rather than belligerent action during it, they are doing more than expressing caution. They are drawing a line around what kind of American power they are still willing to follow. That line is politically explosive. Because it shows that NATO's core governments are not rejecting security cooperation itself. They are rejecting Trump's method. They are rejecting escalation without broad consent. They are rejecting the idea that Washington can redefine a global shipping crisis in openly coercive terms and still expect the alliance to fall in line. That tells us something fundamental about the state of Western power. The alliance is no longer unified by reflex. It now asks harder questions. Is this necessary? Is this lawful in spirit, not just in argument? Is this stabilizing the situation, or widening it? And most importantly, if this goes wrong, who pays the price? Europe already knows the answer to that last question. It will be their energy markets, their households, their domestic politics, and their security environment. That is why the refusal matters so much. It is not symbolic hesitation. It is a structural warning that American allies increasingly see Trump as a producer of risk, not just a manager of it. And that changes the balance of power immediately. Because a superpower is strongest not when it acts alone, but when others believe its actions in large order. Once allies begin stepping back, the raw force remains, but the authority weakens. The ships are still there. The pressure is still there. But the larger Western claim to legitimacy starts to fracture. That is the real meaning of NATO's refusal. Trump may be trying to isolate Iran, but he is also revealing the growing limits of his own coalition leadership. And in geopolitics, that kind of isolation can be just as dangerous as any enemy fleet. The real front line is the consumer: gas, inflation, insurance, and fear. The real front line in this crisis is not only in the Strait of Hormuz. It is in the American checkout line, the American driveway, the American monthly budget. That is where Trump's blockade becomes politically real. Because foreign policy can sound distant until it starts showing up in fuel prices, freight costs, insurance premiums, airline tickets, food bills, and the quiet stress families feel when the economy starts becoming harder to predict again. That is the part many leaders underestimate. They think the public experiences global conflict through flags, speeches, and military maps. Most people do not. They experience it through prices. Through a tank of gas that suddenly costs more. Through a delivery surcharge. Through higher costs passed along by businesses that do not use the language of geopolitics, but still have to survive its consequences. In the real economy, every disruption in a strategic choke point becomes a chain reaction. Shipping risk raises insurance costs. Insurance costs raise transport costs. Transport costs raise prices across the system. And by the time that pressure reaches the consumer, it no longer looks like strategy. It looks like another hit to household stability. This is why the politics of energy are so unforgiving. Gasoline is not just another commodity. It is one of the few prices Americans see constantly, publicly, and emotionally. It sits in giant numbers on street corners. It follows people to work. It follows them to school pickups, grocery runs, and weekend travel. When that number rises, it sends a message deeper than any press briefing ever could: life is getting more expensive, and someone is responsible. Iran understands this. That is why Iran does not need to win a naval showdown to create pressure. It only needs to keep the market nervous long enough for the cost to spread through the American system. And Trump understands it too, even if he does not admit the full danger. Because once consumers start connecting foreign escalation to domestic strain, the narrative changes fast. Strength stops looking like strength if it leaves working families paying more for the basics. There is also a deeper truth here. Inflation is not only about math. It is about trust. When people believe prices will keep rising, they become more defensive, more anxious, and less patient. Businesses delay. Consumers pull back. Investors reassess. That emotional shift can be as damaging as the first price spike itself. So the real battlefield is not just military. It is economic confidence. It is whether Americans feel protected or exposed. And if this blockade keeps sending costs through the system, the most important verdict may not come from admirals or diplomats. It may come from ordinary people deciding they are the ones being made to carry the burden. History's warning: blockades often start as leverage and end as traps. History has a habit of humiliating leaders who think a blockade is a clean instrument. On paper, it always looks disciplined. It looks measured. It looks like pressure without full war, force without chaos, leverage without bloodshed on a massive scale. That is why blockades are so tempting to presidents. They appear to offer control. But history tells a darker story. Blockades rarely stay as neat as the people announcing them. They begin as tools of pressure and often end as traps of commitment. The reason is simple. The moment a leader like Trump ties national credibility to stopping, redirecting, or threatening commercial movement, the blockade stops being just policy. It becomes prestige. It becomes reputation. It becomes a test of whether the leader can enforce what he declared. And once prestige enters the picture, flexibility starts to disappear. Backing down looks weak. Escalating looks dangerous. But standing still is not neutral either, because every day the blockade remains in place, the costs widen and the number of actors affected keeps growing. That is how a pressure tactic becomes a strategic trap. History shows this pattern again and again. Siege logic in the ancient world promised surrender through isolation, yet often produced long suffering, adaptation, and new forms of resistance. In modern times, maritime blockades and sanctions regimes have repeatedly been sold as limited, rational instruments, only to become drawn-out contests of evasion, retaliation, black markets, civilian pain, and political exhaustion. The stronger side often assumes time is on its side. But time can be a weapon for the weaker side too, especially when the stronger side is tied to financial markets, elections, alliances, and public expectations. This is where the economics matter. Once a blockade begins, it creates sunk costs. Resources are committed. Narratives are built. Markets react. Allies position themselves. Rivals test boundaries. Every new complication makes it harder for the original decision-maker to admit that the instrument itself may have been flawed. So instead of recalibrating, leaders often double down. They confuse persistence with control. They mistake endurance for success. And all the while, the system around them becomes more unstable. That is the warning hanging over Trump's blockade now. It may have been launched as leverage against Iran, but history suggests such moves develop a political gravity of their own. One tanker incident, one misread signal, one clash involving a third country, one surge in domestic anger over prices, and the blockade is no longer a tactic. It is a cage. That is the lesson history keeps teaching. Leaders begin blockades because they want options. Too often, they end up with fewer than before. The strategic verdict: strength without discipline turns into systemic risk. The strategic verdict is now impossible to avoid. Trump may believe this blockade proves American strength, but strength without discipline does not stabilize a crisis. It widens it. It spreads risk through every layer of the system until military pressure, market instability, alliance distrust, and political backlash begin feeding each other. That is the real danger now. Not simply that the United States is using power, but that it is using power in a way that may damage the very order American power was supposed to protect. A superpower is not judged only by whether it can threaten. It is judged by whether it can shape events without making the whole system more fragile. That is the standard. And by that standard, this blockade looks far less like strategic control and far more like a high-risk gamble with global consequences. If Trump raises prices, unsettles allies, weakens the moral position of the United States at sea, and deepens the chance of a wider confrontation involving China, then this is not a demonstration of command. It is a demonstration of how easily raw force can become systemic risk when it is detached from restraint. That is the heart of the issue. Power is not the same as leadership. A country can have the biggest navy in the world and still weaken its own position if it teaches allies to doubt its judgment, teaches rivals to exploit its contradictions, and teaches markets to fear its methods. Once that happens, every future act of deterrence becomes more expensive. Every alliance requires more repair. Every crisis carries more suspicion. And every claim that the United States is defending a rules-based order sounds less convincing than before. This is why ordinary Americans should care. Because when strategic discipline breaks down at the top, the consequences do not remain in the situation room. They move outward into fuel costs, interest rate pressure, investment anxiety, military overextension, and a country that slowly discovers it is spending more power to produce less stability. That is never a sign of national renewal. It is a warning sign of strategic drift. The United States is still strong enough to lead. Strong enough to deter. Strong enough to protect global navigation and defend its interests. But real leadership demands something harder than force. It demands proportion. It demands clarity. It demands the patience to understand that not every display of pressure produces real leverage, and not every act of escalation produces respect. So here is the final truth. When strength loses discipline, it stops looking like order and starts behaving like disruption. And when a superpower begins to generate more instability than security, the world does not just lose confidence in that leader. It starts rethinking the entire structure built around that power. This story is not really about one blockade, one speech, or even one president. It is about what happens when power is used without enough discipline, and when a leader begins to mistake pressure for strategy. Trump's move around the Strait of Hormuz was meant to project strength, but the deeper lesson is far more unsettling. In a tightly connected world, one act of force can trigger consequences far beyond its original target. Iran was the immediate focus, but the shockwaves moved outward fast, into oil markets, alliance politics, China's strategic calculations, and the daily lives of ordinary Americans. That is how modern power works. It is never isolated. It is always systemic. The deeper lesson for all of us is simple, but powerful: not every hard move is a smart move, and not every show of strength creates real control. In politics, in business, and even in personal life, impulsive pressure can produce the opposite of what we want. A person may win the moment and still lose the bigger picture. A leader may look strong on camera and still weaken trust, stability, and long-term influence. Real strength is not only about forcing outcomes. It is about understanding consequences, protecting what matters most, and knowing when restraint is actually the higher form of power. That lesson matters in everyday life too. Before reacting in anger, before escalating conflict, before making a decision based only on pride, ask a harder question: will this solve the problem, or will it spread the damage? The people who build stable lives are not always the loudest or the toughest. They are the ones who think beyond the next moment. Now here's a quick question for you. Do you think Trump's Hormuz blockade makes the United States look A. stronger and more decisive, B. more isolated and more dangerous? Comment A or B below. And what is your view overall? Do you think this was a necessary show of force, or a reckless move that could backfire on the United States and the world economy? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can read and discuss. And subscribe to the channel to support us and keep this conversation going with more sharp, honest analysis ahead.